April 29th, 2022 will mark 10 years since the death of Allentown rapper O Head, a.k.a. Michael Randolph, who was 23 when a security guard shot him in the back as he was retreating from an altercation at a nightclub. Randolph's killer was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to a mandatory minimum of 5 years incarceration. But in 2015, a Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision enabled the judge to resentence the convicted man, freeing him after just 2.5 years. I'm Chris Devlin. Here's the story. In the first episode of this two-part podcast revisiting the death of Allentown rapper Michael Randolph, a.k.a. O Head, and the conviction of his killer, Andrew Gesslein, we discussed the events that took place the night of Randolph's death and the aftermath that led to Gesslein's arrest on a charge of manslaughter. As discussed in the previous episode, District Attorney Jim Martin said that the reason Gesslein was charged with manslaughter and not homicide was because authorities could not prove or disprove whether Randolph reached for a gun, as Gesslein testified he did. As a reminder, police found no gun on Randolph, nor did they ever connect one to him. As I stated in the beginning of the first episode, this podcast will revisit the events as they occurred, but I will also be providing some of my own analysis about what happened, not hiding the fact that I do sympathize with the victim and his family. I also won't pass judgment about the killer or suggest what his sentence should have been, but I will ask questions. In this episode, we'll revisit Gesslein's trial, conviction, and his eventual resentencing, which slashed his initial sentence in half. The United States has a long history of seeing black victims put on trial alongside the defendant charged with the actual crime. On this subject, a Harvard Law Review article from February 2021 reads, "Because of implicit biases, information about the victims of violence, such as their criminal records, physical appearances, and lifestyles, can be exploited in an attempt to justify the harm that was inflicted upon them. In particular, there is a substantial risk that defendants tried for acts of violence against black victims will attempt to shift responsibility to those victims by vilifying them, interrogating their pasts, and exploiting negative racial stereotypes about them, activating the implicit bias that connects notions of blackness with criminality." Andrew Gesslein's attorney sought to portray Michael Randolph as a violent person and an aggressor who was culpable for his own death. The defense pointed to Randolph's juvenile record, not an uncommon action in cases like this, but more egregious was the defense's attempt to use Randolph's music, which contains lyrical references to drugs and violence, as evidence of the point they were trying to make. The defense even played one of Randolph's music videos in the courtroom. To this, the prosecutor, District Attorney Stephen Luxa, replied, "Al Pacino played a gangster. That doesn't mean he's a gangster." Besides that, in attempting to make their point, the defense ignored O Head's lyrics that spoke of leaving his past behind him and pursuing his passion for music. The prosecution had raised concerns about Gesslein's past, including that Gesslein falsely claimed, both on court documents and to his wife, that he had previously served as a police officer in Bergen County, New Jersey. Gesslein's wife only learned of this while on the stand at a bail hearing. The jury may or may not have taken the men's past into consideration as they found Gesslein guilty of voluntary manslaughter, meaning the jury believed that Gesslein killed Randolph under an unreasonable belief that he needed to in order to save his own life, or imperfect self-defense. At the time in Pennsylvania, voluntary manslaughter carried a mandatory minimum prison sentence of 5 years up to 20. Judge Robert Steinberg, who presided over the trial, said that this was the most distressing case he had been involved with in his long career, but obligated by law, he reluctantly sentenced Gesslein. At this point, Steinberg becomes a main character of this story. During sentencing, Judge Robert Steinberg said the jury's verdict, quote, "bordered on shocking his sense of justice," and that the jury had failed to consider the weight of the evidence. Steinberg went as far as quoting Martin Luther King Jr. in saying, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Randolph's family testified on behalf of his character, and they said that Randolph's passion for music was helping him to turn over a new leaf. To this, Steinberg replied, "Let's not say that Michael Randolph was this wonderful citizen, because he was not." Steinberg joined the defense in pointing to the lyrical content of Randolph's music as evidence that Randolph was in fact a violent person. Steinberg also mocked the idea that Randolph would have achieved any success as a musician. I guess we'll never know. Steinberg went on to speak highly of Gesslein, noting that the defendant had no prior record, maintained employment, and raised a family, quote, "not just fathered a child." As I stated in the first episode, Randolph's daughter was born 2 weeks before he was killed. Upon appeal, Steinberg ordered a new trial for Gesslein, overturning the jury's guilty verdict. At this point, DA Luxa requested that Judge Steinberg recuse himself from Gesslein's trial, arguing that Steinberg's comments during sentencing demonstrated bias, and that Steinberg's comment to Gesslein during sentencing that had Gesslein been a police officer, he never would have been charged, undermined public confidence in the district attorney. Steinberg would not recuse himself. He wrote in his court opinion that a judge is not required to sit as a potted plant. Nevertheless, the Pennsylvania Superior Court ruled against Steinberg's decision to grant Gesslein a new trial, but this was not the end. In an unrelated December 2015 hearing, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that enhanced penalties for drug violations in school zones were unconstitutional. This led to a high court examination of other mandatory minimum sentences, including that of Andrew Gesslein, and while his conviction was upheld, his sentence was thrown out. Soon after, in what local reports called a rare resentencing, Steinberg ordered Gesslein to serve 31 months, the amount of time he had already been incarcerated. 3 days later, Andrew Gesslein went home, after serving 2.5 years in prison for the killing of Michael Randolph. "He stood up for me," Gesslein said about Judge Steinberg. 10 years later, we're left to wonder, was justice served? Was this fair and equal treatment? In his court opinion, Steinberg wrote, "Michael Randolph either did not possess a firearm, or in the morass of hostility, the firearm was spirited away." Gesslein was the only witness to claim seeing Randolph with a gun. No one found a gun on Randolph or connected one to him. Why was Steinberg as concerned with speculation as he was with concrete evidence? The prosecution conceded that Randolph bore some responsibility in what happened, but was the unarmed victim's error such an offense that his killer should serve less time than some do for victimless crimes? Was Gesslein's error so forgivable that 2.5 years incarceration was a reasonable sentence? What role did systemic racism play in this tragedy? Can a fearful white mind draw a gun into the hand of a black man during a stressful situation? Could a white judge cross a line in sympathizing with the white defendant when the black victim is not there to stand up for themselves? As we ponder these questions, a 10-year-old girl is asking questions of her own. If not now, then sometime soon. I hope that she finds a passion to fill the void left by those questions that have no answers. I'm Chris Devlin. Thanks for listening.